It's Tuesday the 10th of September, and this evening my wife is going into Fact, the Picture House Cinema and Art Centre in Liverpool, for a live cinema screening of an event that's taking place and being broadcast in cinemas across the country, probably around the world. The event itself is actually the launch of a new book by the author Margaret Atwood, and is actually a sequel to her 1980s novel called The Handmaid's Tale. This follow-up, this sequel, is called The Testaments. It's been eagerly anticipated because The Handmaid's Tale is such a huge deal. It's a book that some of you might have read, or certainly may have seen the TV series that was broadcast on Channel 4 over here, but which was broadcast on Hulu. Hulu overseas. Anyway, for those of you who don't know anything about The Handmaid's Tale, I'll give you a kind of brief overview. Now, I must caveat this with an admission. I've never read the book. I obviously work amongst a number of English teachers who all read it, and sometimes I believe even teach it in some of their A-level classes. I've only ever seen some of the TV series. I've not watched it all. But it is a powerful TV show, and I would say something that is a must-watch for those who can kind of stomach it, because some of it is really quite hard going. The basic premise of the novel is that it's a dystopian fiction, and that's a genre which I particularly enjoy reading and enjoy seeing on screen. Films such as Children of Men, I absolutely love. Novels by authors such as Cormac McCarthy, in particular his novel The Road, which is set in a very, very bleak future, or even novels by writers like J.G. Ballard, in particular his novel The Drought, which imagines a kind of future gone wrong, if you like, a far from perfect future, hence the word dystopian as opposed to utopian. And in the case of The Handmaid's Tale, it's set in a future whereby a totalitarian regime has taken over the United States of America and overthrown the United States of America's democracy in a bid to try and solve a problem that a crisis in humanity, whereby the fertility rate has dramatically dropped, so that only a few women can actually fall pregnant and have children, and it puts women in a position in society where they are often basically held captive and are little more than slaves to the richer families who run this totalitarian regime. And it's set in a not so distant but recognisable future, as most dystopian fictions are, and it's deeply disturbing. Might sound just purely from my description as maybe fairly far-fetched, but Atwood always has maintained that the things that she wrote about in the 1980s excuse me, were things that were happening somewhere in the world or had happened. So it was like an amalgamation of kind of the worst parts of different governments and totalitarian states in some ways. And of course, it's, that makes the TV show, and I imagine the book as well, probably more so, deeply unsettling in some aspects in terms of its representations of violence and its representation of I guess, of the life that's been constructed. Now, for me as a viewer, a sort of occasional viewer to the TV show, it is a fantastically well produced show. It's got very high production values. All the performances are brilliant, and it's also got a real stylized feel to it, a sheen of stylized, which I would say doesn't encroach on the substance of the show either. Many of you out there might watch Peaky Blinders, which is another hugely successful and popular TV show, which I've watched. I think I watched 1.5 seasons of, and I must admit, as much as I enjoy the stylistic nature of it, and I really think it's a brilliantly put together show, I sometimes think that the style overtakes the substance, but I might be a little bit unfair there, and that might actually generate a few comments and arguments in the comment section below. But anyway, The Handmaid's Tale, from what I've seen, like I said, very stylish, but also incredibly moving and disturbing in some ways. But one thing I've often, whenever I do catch episodes, often ask my wife about is, well, how did they get to this point? Where, what's the backstory? How did this sort of fictional land of Gilead happen? And how did the United States fall sort of so easily? Because it feels like it's not so distant in the future, and that's almost the bit that I'm kind of finding difficult to suspend my disbelief. Well, I think though the answer to that question is being filled in by the TV series bit by bit as the show goes along. It's now into its third series, and so you're kind of seeing how easily that transition happened between functioning democracy and what essentially becomes a sort of dictatorship, where people were once free and now enslaved. But the reason I mention this is because it happens to coincide with something that's going on in real life right now, and those two different elements collided about sort of 10 days ago when a quotation from The Handmaid's Tale went viral on social media platforms. Now, often dystopian fiction is used, and in fact is often written as a kind of metaphor and an allegory for real life. But then every now and then, dystopian fictions that were perhaps written some time ago, can be brought into sharper focus. And today, if you've not been paying attention to the news, was a fairly significant day in British politics as Parliament was prorogued. Okay, I think I'm saying that right. But basically, this prorogation is when all the business of government is brought to a close, Parliament is closed and suspended. And in this instance, it's been suspended for about 5 weeks. Now, there's been a lot of objection to that, mainly by people who are pro-Remain, who feel that this prorogation has been done to try and stop any further negotiations in trying to make a deal with the European Union. The prorogation is to frustrate those so that the government can leave without a deal, which seems to be its intent at the moment. So there are a number of, if you see the news tonight, you'll see a number of protesters campaigning against that, a number of MPs actually in the House of Commons booing and shouting shame at the government as they leave the House of Commons. All quite dramatic. And this was discovered that this was found to be the case. This was voted on or decided upon by the government about a week and a half ago, and that's when a quotation from The Handmaid's Tale went viral. And this is the quotation. I'll read it to you. I haven't memorised it. That was when they suspended the Constitution. They said it would be temporary. There wasn't even any rioting in the streets. People stayed at home at night, watching television, looking for some direction. There wasn't even an enemy you could put your finger on. And so the kind of prescience of that, the sort of the comparisons people are making, obviously meant that quotation went viral, and people are sort of making connections with our own political situation. So there you go. What do you think about this? I guess is the question I'm asking. Is this quotation what's happening in our Parliament, in our government, with the conflict and the chaos that seems to be ensuing at the moment? Is this the first step towards a kind of darker times? Should we be looking at this as some sort of apocalyptic move towards perhaps a dictatorship, or perhaps some kind of anarchy in the UK? Let me know. Or are people just, as they always do or seem to do, reading too much into a certain situation and finding the perfect quote to maybe stoke those fires? And the second thing, of course, is do you watch The Handmaid's Tale? Have you been following it? Are you in the middle of the next season that's on at the moment, or think maybe just finished? And maybe without any spoilers, leave comments on what you think of that TV show as well. If you've not seen it, I'll put a trailer below, and of course keep your eyes on the TV news and broadcast news and online media to see how the different news outlets are representing the events of today's activities in Parliament. Some of them have been very open and talking very candidly about the different criticisms and the campaigns against it. Some haven't mentioned it at all. So again, really interesting to look at representations of the news in the different news outlets. Until next time though, see you later. Bye-bye.